Today's daf is daf lamed beis, and we're going to begin on daf lamed aleph omid beis, and four lines up before the end of lamed aleph omid beis. Omer Rabbi Chelbo, Chazina leila Rav Huna. I witnessed Rav Huna, the great Rav Huna, de korich la me'echad klapishma, that when he rolled the klaf of the mezuzah, he started from the left side and rolled it towards the right side, from echad back to shma. But more important is the ose parshioseha stumos, that the parshios of Vahayim Shemoah and Shema Vahayim Shemoah were left psuchos, meaning he would leave extra space at the end of the line of the first parsha and then start the second parsha on the next line. That would be psuchos. But instead, he didn't want to do it psuchos, but he wanted to do it stumos, which means that he would not leave any blank space at the end of the line on the last line, but rather just a little bit of space on the same line and start on the same line with Vahayim Shemo with the second parsha. And in the Torah, there are two types of parshios. There are closed parshios, stumos, and there are open parshios, which are psuchos. Now, the two parshios of mezuzah, Vahayim Shemoah, which Rav Huna would make in the mezuzah stumos, and write the last words on the first paragraph at the beginning of a line, leave a small gap, and then begin the second paragraph on the end of that same line. That's called the stuma. And this is the minhag of Rav Huna. But Meisvei, the Gemara challenges Rav Huna from a brisa. Amar Rab Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Meir haya kosva al duchsut mus, okay, which is a kind of in a way a secondary klaf, right? It's a peeled hide, as we mentioned yesterday. Kimin daf, and you make it like a column in the Torah. Now we start today's daf. Kiminyan leiv. The osa revach milamala v'revach lamato. He would have a margin of empty space on the top of the mezuzah and on the bottom. And there's nothing here about the sides of the mezuzah, of the klaf, but Tos suggests that since the mezuzah, as we said before, is rolled from echad, from the left to shema to the right, there has to be a right margin that has to be left enough to sort of, encircle the rolled portion of the mezuzah, just like we have in the Sefer Torah. And the ose parshiosea psuchos, that's exactly the opposite of Rav Huna, who said, as we saw here on Lamed Aleph Amid Beis, that haya ose parshioseha stumos. This is like a head-on collision from a brisa that contradicts Rav Huna. Amarti lo. So when we're talking here about Reb Shimon ben Elazar, right? Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Rebbe, ma tam. In other words, Reb Shimon ben Elazar is turning to his Rebbe, Reb Meir, and he's saying, why do you make it partial secha psuchos when in the Torah itself these partials are stumos? Shouldn't the mezuzah be a replica of the partials in the Sefer Torah itself? Amar li, and he responded to me, "Hol ve'ein smuchos min Torah," and there is no smuchos min Torah. In other words, in the Torah, we have paragraphs that are written, and they're not adjacent one to the other. Like, for example, the Vahaya Parsha does not directly follow the Shema. So the Shema, for example, is in Dvarim Perek Vav, and Vahaya is not until Yud Aleph, like a full 5 prakim later. So since it's not directly following that parsha, so I want to have an open space and not imitate and replicate what went on in the Sefer Torah itself, where they were parshios stumos, because now we have two parshios which are not near each other in the Sefer Torah, and therefore in the mezuzah, I want them to be separate parshios. So how do I separate one parsha from the other? By making them psuchos and leaving the end of the line of the first parsha blank and starting the Omer of Chananel in the name of Rav, halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar. The halacha accepts this brisa with the dialogue between Reb Shimon Elazar and Reb Meir, and therefore the halacha, the parshios and the mezuzahs are psuchos. And it's not 100% clear what Reb Chananel, in the name of Rav, was saying when he ruled like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. My love, we think in the Havamina, psuchos, that we accepted the ruling in accordance with Reb Shimon ben Elazar that the parshios of the mezuzah should be psuchos, and Rav Huna, on the other hand, made the parshios of the mezuzah stumos. So Gemara says, "Lo, that's not what Rav has in mind. When Rav had in mind to paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, it's a revach. He paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar that there had to be empty space on the top and empty space on the bottom. But as far as between Shema and Vayivim Shemoah, Rav didn't take a stand on that issue, and it could very well be that he would agree with Rav Huna that it should be stumos and not psuchos. Now the Gemara wants to know v'kama revach, how much space do you leave on the top and on the bottom? We had a whole discussion about this with regard to a column in the Sefer Torah, but what's the deal in the case of mezuzah, or Menachos bar Yaakov, Amrle, or Rav Shmuel bar Yaakov, kimlo atva disufre. Again, this is something that we don't really know about, but they used to have clips that were used for the Sifrei Torah. And what was the purpose of the clips? He explains in the Shita Mekubetzes that these are clips that were used by the Sofrim to keep the scroll from curling while he was writing upon it. In other words, he spread it out, the parchment, and then he would write on it. And sometimes it would curl over, so you'd use a clip to keep it down, like we use clothespins, whatever it might be. And the slits in these clips were of a standard depth. So spaces, the depths of these slits must be left on top, on the bottom. Okay, then, and that's what they did. Amalei Abaye l'Rav Yosef, the atlo tizbra dechi omer of arevach. Abaye turns to Rav Yosef and he says, "You don't agree that when Rav made the statement that we paskin lahalacha like Rav Elazar Reb Shimon, he was referring to revach, meaning, Rav Yosef." Let's go back for a second here. There was a statement of Rabbi Chalvo in the name of Rav Huna, describing the minhag of Rav Huna. And it seems that there was a whole issue about whether or not we paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar with regard to revach. And Abaye, wants to challenge Rav Yosef and say, wait a minute, you don't agree that when Rav gave his ruling that we paskin like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, he was specifically relying to the referring to the revach and not to the separation between one parsha and the other. For Rav Isle Minhag, Rav relies on a minhag. In other words, when you have questions in halacha, check out the minhag. That's Rav's shita. V'ha'idna nohug alma bestumos. We actually have adopted the minhag of Rav Huna, and we have logical reason to assume that once the minhag was adopted, then Rav would also validate that minhag, and we write the mezuzah stumos. So therefore, when Rav paskins like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, he was not paskening psuchos, that you should leave it psuchos. And now the Gemara wants to prove that Rav relies on minhag. The Omer Rabba, Omer Rav Kahana, Omer Rav. And now we get into a whole discussion about what's called chalitza. And the Torah requires that the choletzes will remove the shoe from the yavam. And the question is, what's the shoe? There were different types of shoes. Some were made of hard leather and other from soft leather. And Rav made a statement that if Eliyahu will come and he will be makil and be lenient and say, you know what, you could even use a shoe for chalitza as opposed to in addition to a sandal. And we'll explain the difference between a shoe and a sandal in the context of Dvarim Perek Chaf Hey, where the Torah says v'choletz min olav, and there's a soft leather kind of a shoe that you adjust to the shape of the top of the foot through straps that are wrapped over the leather. And then there's a sandal, which is a hard leather top of the shoe, which is pre-molded to the shape of the top of the foot. So again, is it soft and therefore it is adjustable for each person to fit the top of his shoe, or is it set like a sandal, which is hard leather, and it's pre-molded to fit the top, the shape of the top of the foot? Now, it seems the common practice was to use the sandal, the hard leather sandal. And according to Rabbah, with regard to the shoe, which was soft leather, the Rabbanah did not want us to use that shoe for chalitza. So Rabbah now states the following: if an authority as great as Eliyahu would come and rule for us that the gezerah that the Rabbanah instituted against using a shoe for chalitza would no longer apply, then we would obey him. He's being mekil. Because he would not do so unless he really perceives that, the gezerah should not apply. But if Eliyahu or some authority would come and say, you know what, I want to ban the use of a sandal for chalitza, maybe there's a remote concern that he would be afraid that somehow, the sandal, because it's made of soft leather, might not exactly fit the foot, and that we would not accept, because we don't obey even a great scholar to undermine and contravene a minhag. And therefore, ein cholzin, if he tells us ein cholzin b'sandal, which is our minhag, that's the accepted minhag, we use a soft leather sandal for chalitza, ein shomelo, we don't listen to him, shekvar nagu on b'sandal, we've already accepted and embraced that minhag. For Rav Yosef Omer of Karno Omer, Rav, he has just the exact opposite. If Eliyahu would come along and he would substantiate and certify the gzeira that we have of avoiding a minol, then we would certainly obey him. But ein cholzim v'sandal, ein shomelo shekvar nago v'sandal. Now, it sounds like Rav Yosef is repeating almost word for word that which Rav Kahana said in the name of Rav. So what's the difference? And the Gemara asks, Mina mai beinayu? Mino lechatchila ika beinayu. Rabbah said that we should obey Eliyahu if he's going to allow us to use a shoe, a minol. He's implying that initially, if not for Eliyahu and Navi, we would not allow the use of a shoe because of that gzeira that we mentioned before. Whereas Rav Yosef, who says that we would obey Eliyahu if he would not allow the use of a shoe, meaning if he would generate a gzeira and midrabanan prohibit the use of a shoe, that would imply that if not for Eliyahu's ruling, we do allow the shoe even initially. So that's the nafkamina between the two. But we see clearly that since the minig was to make the parshios of the mezuzah stumos. Therefore, we follow that minhag and we do stumos. And therefore, it couldn't be that Rav was paskening like Rab Shimon ben Elazar, and he was advocating in favor of psuchos. That would be against our minhag, but really, we have to assume that Rav was advocating halacha Rab Shimon ben Elazar only with regard to revach, to the space that you have to leave open at the top and the bottom of the mezuzah. Shmami. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Okay, we might have a possibility that Rav would have accepted Rav Shimon Elazar even with regard to psuchos, because mitzvah lasosam stumos, but the iavdinu psuchos shapradami. Even though we prefer lechatchila that you follow the minhag and Rav Kahana, and what do? Rav Huna, sorry. And what do? You make it stumos, but nevertheless, if he went ahead and he made it psuchos, we'll accept it. The Diavad will accept it. Umay psuchos the Kamer Reb Shimon ben Elazar. You'll ask me, how can you tell me that we are going to advocate in favor of stumos and then tell me that it's okay to do psuchos? That's not going to fit in with Reb Shimon Elazar, who was advocating that we do psuchos. And now we're going to have to answer af psuchos. In other words, when Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak made the statement, Yavdina psuchos shapridami, what he meant to say is even psuchos. But it would certainly seem that lechatchilu we should follow the minhag and do stumos. Le Mesayele, we have a brisa to support Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Kayotzibo, we have a similar idea in the Sefer Torah Shebola, Utfilin Shebolu. So you have worn out Sifrei Torah, worn out Tefillin. What are you going to do with them? You want to use them for Kedusha, for something of sanctity. Ein Osaman Mezuzah, but we cannot make them into Mezuzah because the Sefer Torah, the Tefillin, have already achieved a great level, a high level of intense Kedusha, and we can't lower that level of Kedusha, even though now it's Bolu, and we've taken it out of circulation, but still, that Kedusha is chal sort of duch and duch, in the very fiber of the klaf, and therefore, ein osameh mezuzah. Mezuzah is on a lower level, because Morida Kedusha Chamur Kedusha. If you would do so, you would take the higher and more intense level of Kedusha and lower it to a lower level of Kedusha. So the Brisa implies that HaMoridin Osin, meaning if not for the problem of Ein Moridin, if we could be Morid the Kedusha, then it would be okay. And you would use the klaf of a Sefer Torah or that of Tefillin to cut out the parshios of Shema v'Hayim Shmo to make a mezuzah. My hacha stumos v'hacha psuchos. After all, in the case of the parshios as they are written in the Sefer Torah, they're stumos. And now you want to use them for mezuzah. A mezuzah is psuchos. Anyway, according to Rabbi Meir, it seems like the parshios of mezuzah are stumos, and now it was reported that Rabbi Meir would make them psuchos. So therefore, we're going to interpret Rabbi Meir, who says that you make them psuchos, the way that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak interpreted it, means he would be machshir the mezuzah even though they're psuchos. But certainly they could be stumos. And that's our minhag, to make them stumos. So Gemara says, you know what? Lema Misayela, you want to bring a proof to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak? I can reject that proof. Why? Dilma lahashlim. Rav Meir really, in truth, means that the mezuzah must be psuchos, not like our minhag. But perhaps what the brisa means is only to say that, if you want to demote something from a high level of kedusha to a low level of kedusha, it's permitted to do so, or it's not permitted, but theoretically, if one would be permitted to do so, then he could take out a Sefer Torah Shabbalah and use it for a mezuzah, complete a mezuzah. What does it mean to complete a mezuzah? If a mezuzah were missing a line, one could cut that line out of a one Sefer Torah and sew it into the mezuzah to complete it. That's pretty wild. Tosas, however, is a different pshat. There's a case where a person wishes to use one of the different psukim at the beginning or the end of a mezuzah by writing the other pasuk on a blank margin that is above or beneath it. So, for example, Shema concludes in the Sefer Torah at the end of the column. In such a case, he would write V'hoya in the bottom margin. If V'hoya appears on the top of the column, he would write Shema in the upper margin. Ha'moridin osin. If not for the problem of ein moridin, then we could take a Sefer Torah Shabbolah or Tefillin Shabbolah and make it into a mezuzah. What about the following problem? Vatanya haloch l'Moshe miSinai tefillin al klaf, and certainly a Sefer Torah requires klaf. Mezuzah, but on the other hand, a mezuzah is al dus which, as we said before, is that part of the hide. Klaf b'makom basar, but this halacha Moshe Misina tells us that you have to write on the surface of the klaf in the place of the meat, whereas dursustavus is b'makom seyar. One writes on the surface in the place of the hair. So how then could the Bryce imply that if theoretically it would be permitted to downgrade the sanctity of tefillin to mezuzah, you could use the writing of a worn-out tefillin for mezuzah? Tefillin are written on klaf, mezuzah is written on dus. And the Gemara answers the mitzvah that halis halacha Moshe Sinai is not a critical halacha Moshe Sinai, but rather it's the preferred procedure. The optimum for tefillin is to be written on klaf and mezuzah on dus. But either one is valid if it's written on the other side, on the other type of parchment. And it's very interesting that the halacha Moshe Sinai is only lechatchila. I once used this concept to explain the shita the Tosfos read that Kiddush al Yayin is halacha Moshe Sinai, and I wanted to suggest in a careful reading of the Tosfos read that that a loaf of bread would be also acceptable for Kiddush. There's halacha Moshe Sinai of Yayin. That's only lechatchila. If all things are ideal, you use Yayin. Anyway, Vatanya Shina Apostle. We have a brisa that says if you deviated from the type of klaf, then it's possible. So it's not just halacha Moshe Sinai lechatchila and lemitzvah. And where it says tefillin, the brisa is referring only to tefillin, to invalidate tefillin that were not written on klaf, but they were written on dursustus. But it doesn't mean to invalidate a mezuzah that was written on klaf. Adarabah, your klaf is even greater than dursustus. Gemara asks what Tanya, but we learned in the brisa shina bein bazeh pasul, meaning again, if one deviated from the category of parchment, either in the case of tefillin or in the case of mezuzah, it's invalid. So don't tell me that you don't want to invalidate a mezuzah that was written on klaf. And the answer is idi tefillin. Right, both refer to tefillin. And one brisa is referring to writing the klaf in the place where the hair is. And v'ha, and now we turn to Daf Lamed Beis, the chasvinu where he wrote on Duchsustus, the Mokum Basar, in the place where the meat is. So even though he wrote them on the meat surface, which is the right way to do it for tefillin, they're invalid because they were written on Duchsustus rather than on Klav.